Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started. Thanks so much for joining the webinar today. I am Emily Knight, Outreach Manager with the Lundfest Ocean Program. For those of you that do not know us, the Lundfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address needs facing decision makers and stakeholders. To learn more, visit us at our website, lundfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us at Lundfestocean on Twitter. We will also be live tweeting this webinar and every webinar on the hashtag LOPwebinar. Feel free to use it and engage with us there. We have joining us today Dr. Phillip Levin, lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy and professor at University of Washington, Dr. Alison Cullen, professor and associate dean at University of Washington, and Dr. Laura Koehn, postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington. They will discuss their project, Vulnerability Assessments for West Coast Fishing Communities to Climate Change. This project has been underway for several months now, so the purpose of the webinar is for the research team to share insights into how they developed this research, their progress, and next steps for the coming year. As some of you may know, we at Lundfest work with our grantees to not just share information about projects when there are results, but to engage interested audiences among managers, policymakers, and stakeholders throughout projects to spark dialogue, get feedback, and promote transparency. To that end, we will make our contact information available. My email is on the slide, and the researchers will provide theirs, so reach out anytime. I've also created a running distribution list to continually update folks on progress and future outreach activities. If you are not on that, or unsure if you are, just send me a note. Finally, we are recording this webinar and will distribute the link broadly. Before I turn it over to Phil, a few webinar logistics. We have all attendees muted. With so many people on the line, this is to prevent feedback or echoes. We will have time at the end for questions. Use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question at any point during the webinar today. We will keep track of the queue and will read it aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to them all, but folks are welcome to follow up with us at Lundfest or the research team. I'm now going to turn it over to Phil Levin. Phil, I am transferring the presenter privileges to you.
Thanks, Emily. And just to reemphasize, we're in the early part of the project, and so we really would like any feedback you have and any conversations that this might spark. We're super interested in pursuing. And also, as Emily said, this will be presented today by me, Phil, and Alison and Laura, also important members of our team. I'd say even critical, probably, definitely, is Laura Nelson. She's our PhD student, Molly Bokeberg, who's at the Nature Conservancy in Washington, and Estrella Strawn, who is a Sea Grant Fellow at the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. Okay, hang on. And so really what we're trying to do today, two things. One is to just be very transparent about what we're doing, and again, seeking feedback, and also just to highlight the key elements of the project. And we're at our early stages, so we're really going to focus on methods, where we're at, and a lot about where we're going. Our work is focused in the California current on the US West Coast. There are about 125 fishing communities, depending on how you define a fishing community, along our region. And there's obviously a lot of money and jobs that are result as this. And we're already seeing climate impacts here in this region and lots of different fisheries. And also right now, the Pacific Fisheries Management Council is engaging in something called the Climate and Communities Initiative, which is part of their fisheries ecosystem plan. And our work really is inspired by and motivated by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. So this work, this Climate and Communities Initiative, is a scenario planning exercise, um, thinking about how do we manage in anticipation of shifts in species, how do we think about how we deal with climate within and between fisheries management plans, and what are the impacts of all this on communities. And the outputs of the PFMC exercise are going to be a series of tools and products and processes thinking about how fisheries management can and should deal with climate change. So this is an inspiration of our work. And our work is really going to focus on two major questions. First is, what's the vulnerability of fishing communities along the US Pacific coast to climate change? And secondly, what management strategies would most effectively reduce this vulnerability moving forward? And so I want to emphasize here that this is not vulnerability of fisheries resources or species. It's really focused on the communities themselves. So that is how, when fisheries resources change because of climate, how did this propagate into communities, and how do we effectively reduce that vulnerability to communities? And for us, this is sort of a central component to what we're talking about. So when we're talking about vulnerability, we're talking about a combination of two things. One is the risk to communities as a result of climate impacts on fisheries resources. And then the second component is the resilience or adaptability of those communities to that change. And we know that community risk is a function of two things. One is going to be the exposure to the fisheries resources, to climate impacts. And second is that once a species is exposed to it, how sensitive is it to that climate impact? And on the community side, there's a series of bins that you can think about, and that Laura will talk about again later on in this presentation, that highlights different attributes of communities that make them more or less resilient to any sort of impact. And here I want to highlight that our work is inspired by a number of researchers in the vulnerability area, largely outside of fisheries, I would say, but not completely, particularly the Jepson and Colburn work is really important foundational work for us. And this was also sort of implemented on the West Coast by Karma Norman at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And so why bother with this framework? I want to just highlight that thinking about vulnerability is really different than just straight up risk. So including the community characteristics makes a big difference. And here's an example from some work we did a couple of years ago. And this is showing in hotter colors more wildfire risk to communities in California. So that's straight up risk. We get a different map when we look at vulnerability. That is, when we look at both the biophysical risk of fire combined with characteristics of the community. And when you can even zoom in, for example, in this area here, you see a red area here. I don't know if my clicker thing shows. But that's campfire, the place Paradise where the campfire was. So that was an area that we knew was going to be very vulnerable to fire, and that's because it has two combinations. One is there's a high fire risk there, but also the demographics, the economic, and the access to information and the transportation capabilities in that area were all limited. So it was sort of knowing that we might have done things a little bit differently in terms of our planning. So what we're doing in this project is sort of a mixed methods approach to this vulnerability analysis, and we'll talk about these in going through the talk. First, we're using existing biophysical and socioeconomic data to think about vulnerability, so we can use as Laura will talk about all different sorts of information that's in existence and do analyses. Secondly, we're doing surveys of commercial fishers to get perspectives on vulnerability from this important stakeholder group. And we'll follow this up with focus groups. And Alison will talk about the surveys and focus groups. The basic idea of the project is that we can use data to think about the exposure of fisheries resources, the sensitivity of resources, and adaptability of communities, and combine those together and get one estimate that we're calling an empirically derived community vulnerability estimate. On the other hand, we can get similar information through surveys with stakeholders and focus groups with stakeholders. So we get perceptions of exposure, perceptions of sensitivity, and perceptions of adaptability. And we can, again, combine these together to get estimates of community vulnerability. And then the idea of this project is then we combine these two information streams together and get an integrated assessment of vulnerability of fishing communities, with the idea ultimately to improve sustainability of fisheries in a way that benefits both nature and people. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alison, who will talk a little bit about why we're using this mixed method approach. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I got nervous that I was just talking to myself for the last 5 minutes. Okay, take it away, Alison.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So I'm going to dig into the added value of using the combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. And overall, this combination just really gives us a richer picture. We can integrate sort of on-the-ground local experience and information with more regional and maybe spatially averaged measures, or integrate more immediate short-term information with a longer-term picture. And this allows us to support communication and about vulnerability in particular, and to advise and support decision making, keep strategy nimble and adaptive. Next slide. So I wanted to say something about qualitative and quantitative methods, in particular to assess vulnerability, but what this really means vis-a-vis empirical and subjective information. So empirical information, in this case, we're thinking about measurements, we're thinking about model projections, we're thinking about what sort of appears to be the super objective type of information. But we know that there are subjective elements to it. We know that if we have measurements, someone decided what to measure and how to measure it. If we have model results, we know that someone decided what assumptions to make. So there's a lot of subjectivity in what we call empirical data, and this sort of what some people think of as quantitative information. It is true, though, that when we have this sort of empirical data, it does encompass a lot of spatial and temporal averaging. There may be extremes or thresholds that we can either call out or that end up being sort of diluted or suppressed. It may not be finely granular information. So I would contrast this with subjective information, which in this case is more local and experiential. But I want to note that this type of information, and this would be collected, say, in surveys or perhaps in focus groups, this information may be expressed very quantitatively. So if someone asks, what fisheries are you active in? And we get a set of respondents who tell us, across the set of fisheries, we will then have quantitative information that says, percentages of respondents who indicated certain fisheries. So it is quantitative, but it is a qualitative answer. It's a yes, no across the different categories. Next slide, please. So drivers of the perception of risk. So on the side of subjective information about what is perceived about vulnerability and the risk and adaptive capacity that go into it, we know that demographics, folks' experiences will drive their perception of risk. Personality traits, how risk-seeking they are, how comfortable they are with risk. Networkedness, which involves access to information, how many different sources of information an individual may have access to. Worldview is also important. So folks are perhaps hierarchical or egalitarian, fatalistic or individualistic. And I'll talk a little bit about what a couple of those are as we go along. But basically, fatalists can't believe that we can't avoid misfortune by our own individual actions, and individualists tend not to seek advice from others. And those are the two that we'll dig into a little bit. And then qualitative characteristics of the risks themselves will drive how they're perceived. So if it's a familiar risk, or we take it on voluntarily, or whether it's more dreaded, whether we feel like it's fair that we are being exposed to a certain risk, that will all drive our perception of that risk. Next slide. So perceptions of vulnerability do drive decisions, and those perceptions may not be aligned with those more conventional or empirical scientific observations, measurements, and model projections that I was mentioning. And we know that managing risk to livelihood requires us to understand various scales of vulnerability. There are decisions that happen at the individual level as fishers want and need to keep fishing, but are also wanting to make sure fish populations are sustained into the future. Regional management strategies. The goal is definitely to help advise fishing councils who are tasked with managing fisheries in a changing ocean. And there are sort of things that happen at that more regional level. And communication and coordination is key here. So making this type of information available across these sort of bounds. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a couple examples from farming where some of this survey of risk perception and vulnerability work has been done, and then tie it back to what we're doing with our survey of fishers. Next slide. So perceptions of vulnerability vary. Why is this? So the example that I'll start with involves a survey that was done. This was in Vietnam. It was farmers. And we had a very strong historic record of long-term warming in that region. And in a survey, 1,200 farmers were asked, do you perceive significant changes in the climate, and how concerned are you about these? And vast majority of them said they had seen significant changes in climate and were concerned. And so we were asking, are you perceiving it to be colder, hotter, wetter, drier, and so forth? And those were all independent questions. So if you felt that there were more extremes, or the growing season was colder, but the rest of the year was hotter, you could independently indicate colder and hotter, which is why these don't add up to 100% here. And quite a few reported colder, which was interesting because we had this historic record of long-term warming. And 72% had also said they were worried about their livelihood being impacted by this colder temperature. So this was quite interesting. And what we realized was we had just happened to hit with our survey timing a sort of historic monsoon and a typhoon that hit, and temperatures dropped dramatically for a very short period of time that in general wouldn't show up in the long-term warming record, which was very robust and very long-standing. But to that immediate time period, there was a cold snap that really affected people. So the plot that you see on the left-hand side shows vertically the yield of the autumn rice paddy that folks were growing, and then across time on the horizontal axis. And you can see that the yields from autumn paddy were growing over time, and that's partly associated with more land being cultivated. But you get a big dip in this one particular year, and that was the year when we just happened right after that cold snap. We happened to survey, and indeed, those folks were right. They did see a major effect that year of something that on a granular level was very finely granular. Next slide, please. I have another example. This one is farmers in Mali. And the question here is, how do and why do perceptions of vulnerability vary across risk domain? And if you look at the plot on the left side, down the vertical, these are different kinds of risks that these Mali farmers worried about. They worry about armed conflict. They worry about a lack of buyers for their produce, worsening debt situation, community relationships, more extreme weather and climate extremes, and injuries at work. And we explored the role of worldview, of their risk orientation, of their connectedness and sort of information access, and their gender on their perceptions of vulnerability to each of these risk domains. And we tried to tease out which drivers for which risks. At the top of that left-hand panel, you see the question that they were asked. How frequently have you worried about the following risks in the past 12 months? And they would indicate 1 for not at all, 2 for sometimes, and 3 for all the time. And then what you have is you have the average across all the female respondents and the average across all the male respondents, female yellow, male purple. And you can see that they don't have sort of a uniform picture of worry across all of these risk domains. There's definitely differences in the perception of vulnerability across domains. And if you look down to that second from the bottom, more extreme weather, that is a major player. And of course, for farmers, we would expect that. So next slide. So we dug into a little bit about what drove those perceptions of risk and what drove the differences between them. And in Mali, the increased risk perception was associated with worldviews. So the fatalists and the individualists, those who felt that their individual actions couldn't change what was coming in terms of risk, or the individualists who chose to go it alone, they tended to perceive risk higher. Folks who were more connected to more sources of information perceived risk more highly as well. Risk orientation, the folks who were optimists or risk seekers tended to perceive risk lower. The income secure, it was a mixed picture. It depended what kind of risk we were talking about. Some of them, for some risks, you can actually be buffered by your income security. For others, you can't. Maybe armed conflict is one where you may be able to get yourself to a safer situation. For some others, you might not be able to. And those who were poor in time, so they were quite tight for time, working many hours, perceived risk more highly across all risks. Specifically related to extreme weather, we had a very distinct picture of how folks perceived risk. And individuals have little or no control over extreme weather coming. They have some control over how they try to manage and adapt to that. But we found more worry among men, and this was unusual because in general, across all the other risks, women were more worried than men. Those who didn't have children and the time and income poor were specifically very worried about extreme weather. Next slide, please. So I'd like to turn to the surveys that we're doing and call out again Laura Nelson, our excellent PhD student. Next slide. So the research questions we're trying to get at with our survey include, what are Fishers' perceptions of their vulnerability to climate change? And what factors influence those perceptions? What impacts in particular are of most concern? And then our goal is to integrate perceptions with empirical vulnerability assessment and have that richer picture that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So in terms of specific survey queries, we tend to ask, how is the ocean changing? What are you observing? Are changes to ocean resources affecting your well-being? Where well-being has that very rich sort of definition with connections, capabilities, and conditions components, and also cross-cutting elements of equity and justice. And how well can you cope with any changes? What is your picture for adaptability? Next slide, please. So the approach for this survey, there's a random sample of 1,200 fishers who have commercial licenses in the state of Washington or Oregon, and there are some folks in California who have these as well. So far, we've sent postcards. They've been responding. They can either take the survey online or with a mobile device. And we have pretty even representation across Puget Sound, Washington Coast, Columbia River, and Oregon Coast, and fairly robust representation. There are very few from Northern California, Central and Southern California, since they would have to have licenses, as I say, in Washington or Oregon. The survey method itself is mixed mode. We have mostly Likert scale questions where people are asked, agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or how concerned they are about certain kinds of outcomes and certain kinds of vulnerabilities. And we pilot tested this, and also it passed through the University of Washington Human Subjects Institutional Review Board before we administered it. Next slide, please. So we're targeting spring 2020 for survey results, and hoping to attract lots of people to take this survey. This survey will give us perceptions about vulnerability, both individual and community well-being associated with climate change, which we think will be quite useful and quite helpful. Next, please. And we will be also in spring undertaking focus groups, and this is at the council meeting that will happen in Vancouver, Washington. We anticipate hosting 30 to 40 people at a kind of happy hour where we have a focus group. We will provide context for our survey results. We'll provide people with some of our results and ask them to rank and sort of sort their levels of concern about various outcomes that we've observed. We'll explore both how they actually rank and then how they go about ranking. So we'll debrief with folks and see sort of what mental models they had and exactly how they approach the task of trying to rank and sort various kinds of concerns. Next, please. And I'll turn it over to Laura Koehn for empirical assessment. Thanks, Phil.
All right, Phil, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to dive more into our empirical assessment of vulnerability. Next slide. So Phil kind of touched on this earlier, but there are three components that make up our calculations of empirical vulnerability. The first two combine to be the risk that a community will face with climate change. And these two are exposure and sensitivity. And exposure in this case will be the projected climate change impacts on fisheries resources, so fish and other species that these communities rely on. And then the sensitivity is all about how reliant are these communities on fisheries economically, based on revenue and other sources. And I will dive more into these in a little bit, but then next slide, Phil. So then we also need to tie in this adaptability or adaptive capacity, or how well these communities might be able to cope with future climate change. And altogether, these combine to make community vulnerability. Next slide. So we can take these and think about them as two axes of vulnerability. So on one axis, you have this risk to the fisheries resources that the communities rely on. And on the other axis, you have how adaptive these communities are to climate change. Next slide. And then we can plot a value for each of these against each other, and the distance from the origin becomes the overall vulnerability that a community will face. Next slide. So this is important because then there are multiple ways that a fishing community can be vulnerable. So first of all, if the fisheries resources have a high risk, so the red dot on the y-axis, then that community can have high vulnerability if they're very dependent on those high risk resources. But then also, even if the resources are fish or not at risk, the community can still have high vulnerability if their adaptive capacity is low. So the red dot on that near the x-axis. And then also, if there's some combination of low adaptive capacity and high resource risk, they can also be highly vulnerable. And then this also becomes key because even if the fisheries are at risk, there might be other ways to lower the vulnerability the community faces if we can potentially increase the adaptive capacity that a community has. Next slide. Okay, so now diving into a little more about how we're getting each of these components. So first of all, for the predicted exposure, or again, the climate change impacts on the fisheries resources, we first needed to figure out what resources these communities are most dependent on. So using data from PACFIN, we found the top 90% of species by landings for each port on the West Coast. And this gives us in the end about 60 species for the entire West Coast, and it includes both federally and state managed species. So Dungeness crab is in there, Chinook salmon is also a species in there, along with a bunch of other species. Next slide. So then we are doing our own calculation of the risk that these species are facing. And how we're doing that is we are taking distributions compiled from maps, so distributions for each species of their current distribution in the ecosystem, and looking at the expected changes in environmental conditions within their existing ranges. And by environmental conditions, I mean current and future temperature, chlorophyll, pH or acidity, oxygen, currents, and sea surface height and salinity within those regions. We'll also look at the breadth of environmental conditions that each species currently is exposed to think about how sensitive they might be with future changes, with the idea that species with wider breadths are able to cope with more future conditions than other species. Next slide. So then we have the sensitivity component, and again, this is all related to the economic dependence of communities on fisheries. And we're fortunate to be working with Karma Norman at the NOAA Northwest Center, who, for the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, calculates this reliance metric every year. And what this metric includes is the per capita commercial activity for each community, So it's based on landings and revenue, number of permits for each region, and the processing that occurs in each region. And this gives us an idea of how reliant these communities are economically on fishing. And the map here has little diamonds for each port community that we're looking at, but then the communities that have labels are the ones that were most reliant for 2016. Next slide. And then finally, we need to think about this adaptability or adaptive capacity component. Again, we're fortunate that Karma Norman for the integrated ecosystem assessment every year calculates this social vulnerability score. So in this case, higher social vulnerability will mean lower adaptive capacity. And Karma and NOAA calculate this metric using data from the American Community Survey or the census. And it combines indices related to personal disruption, so things like unemployment and crime for an area, but also population composition, so general demographics of a region, and then poverty or the percent of a population within poverty in a region. Labor force structure, which includes how many people are employed, who is employed in each region, and then different components of housing characteristics and housing disruption, which is all about rent prices in the area and how those are changing over time, and other housing availability within the region. And this all comes from Jepson and Colburn that Phil mentioned earlier, and can combine together to give some type of community resilience. And in this case, with the social vulnerability, again, I have all the ports shown on the map, but the ones with the highest social vulnerability or lowest adaptive capacity are have labels in the map. Next slide. So far, this has been a lot about this first question, and we really haven't touched a lot on the second question. So I want to briefly go over just a little bit about what we're thinking about the second question, which is, again, what management strategies would most effectively reduce vulnerability for these communities? Next slide. So briefly, how we're going to look at this, we're going to take our current community vulnerability that we're calculating and using a food web model, a recent food web model of the California current, along with various climate scenarios and also different management strategies that we will come up with. We will project everything through time and come up with different alternative futures of what this vulnerability might look like in the future. And hopefully some strategies that we come up with might end up leading to lower vulnerability for communities that were currently vulnerable. And I think that's it for me. I think I'm going to hand it back to Phil to wrap things up.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And so I just wanted to end with some sort of what the timeline is and some of our next steps. So we have a lot of stuff happening right now. So we're fielding the survey that Alison talked about. The focus groups are coming up in April. The empirical assessment that Laura talked about is ongoing, and we hope she's done in the summer. And then the modeling work, which Laura finished on, will I guess we're saying winter 2020. And so what I want to say here is that this is actually when the end of the beginning is. And what I mean by that is we are collaborating with the Ocean Modeling Forum. So the Ocean Modeling Forum is a group at the University of Washington, which is where the managing director is Tessa Francis, and Andre Punt and I are the directors. And is a group that brings together working groups, and these working groups address issues on ocean management using a variety of different modeling frameworks. And so the next Ocean Modeling Forum working group is focused on climate and communities. And the idea here with this group, and this sort of illustrated here, the members of the group, which include our team, that's working on this project, as well as a number of different social scientists, modelers, and economists. And the idea here is to go beyond what we're doing in this project and really come up with specific, or to come up with a toolbox to address specific questions that are relevant to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council and others. And the idea here is that the Community and Climate Initiative of the Council will be generating a number of scenarios. And this provides us a launching pad to think about what are the issues we're concerned about. We can analyze the consequences of these various scenarios that they'll come up with, as well as others that we might imagine ourselves or others bring to us. And so I'm going to stop there and just thank, first of all, LenFest, for the money and stuff, but also for engaging us intellectually. And they've actually, if you've never worked with LenFest, you should, because they contribute enormously to the projects. It's not just money, it's their intellectual contributions are really important, I think. And also, you notice throughout that we mentioned a lot of collaborations with folks from the Northwest and Southwest Fisheries Science Center, which we really appreciate. The Nature Conservancy has given us some resources in terms of in-kind folks, or I guess, people to help us on these projects. And then we really also appreciate the Pacific Fisheries Management Council for engaging us on this project and for helping us move this along. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Phil. Do you want to pass the presenter privileges back to me?
I really do.
All you have to do is drag the ball.
No, where I lost the ball. Oh. I've dropped the ball. Where is the ball?
Should be over your, it should be over your initials.
For the folks on the line, we did practice this, and it's failing. It's not showing up, Emily.
It might help if you stop sharing your screen first.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, stop sharing your screen, and then I can actually do it for you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm making.
Oh, yeah.
I realize that because I'm the host, I can do whatever I want. Like.
Can you pass the ball back to you?
Yep, we're all set.
Okay.
And now I'm gonna put up our ending slide. So as I mentioned to folks, if you want to ask questions, submit them into the Q&A. We already have a few coming in. So I'm going to start off with a question. What categories do the stakeholders surveyed fall into? Are they business leaders, fishers, policymakers? Just trying to understand what the overall population looks like.
They're entirely commercial fishers. In this case, they're commercial fishers who hold licenses in Oregon and Washington. We would have California, but the rules of California are such that getting contact information is difficult. And so we're exploring other ways to work with the California commercial fishing industry.
And we do just have a few from California right now who hold permits in Washington or Oregon.
I should also mention that through collaborations, it's likely that we'll be expanding the geographic scope of our survey work as well. Laura Nelson, our PhD student, has been in discussions with folks in different parts of the country about and North America about doing that.
Great,
so the same commercial fishing focus.
Great. And yeah, do you want to say, the next question is related to the California license holders. Is there anything more you want to say about the gap that presents in your study?
No, I mean it does it does create a gap, and we have some ideas of how to solve that. And yeah, so we basically if I didn't say it clearly, I mean the problem is that the rules that govern how the state shares information are more stringent in California. So unlike Washington, where the rules allow sharing of addresses, that's not the case in California, just against their regulations. So they can't do it. Therefore, what we need to do is reach out directly to industry groups and work with them directly in order to get the survey done. So we have that perspective represented in our analysis.
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions on representation. Do you have concerns that the views of Pacific Northwest fishers won't be representative of California fishers, and that views of those fishers who attend council meetings won't be representative of the larger group of fishers?
The first, the answer to the first question is yes. That is a problem, and we're working to overcome that. On the council one, we're not focused on council people that attend the council, except for the focus group. We'll do a focus group at a council meeting, but for the rest of it, these are just randomly selected license holders. So they may or may not be engaged actively with the council process.
Can I just add to that, that we will be careful when we interpret our information to, state who we captured with our survey. So we will know, relative to the pool of folks who got the postcard, who responded, who took the survey, and if those proportions of folks from Washington or Oregon places fall in same proportions that we saw in our original pool. I mean, all of that is good survey methodology. So we won't just assume that what we hear back represents the whole pool.
Okay, great. All right. And looking through the next one. There we go. Okay, so thank you for the great presentation. What is the strategy to get the results of this work in the hands of managers? What do you see as the role of the Pacific Fishery Management Council in using the information generated from this work? And related to this, I also got a question via chat about where the data from this work will be available. So also getting a question about that.
I guess I'll start and other folks can chime in. So the strategy for getting it to the council, was that the first question? So we'll be engaging with the council directly. So both through the Climate and Communities Initiative, so engaging with them and providing results as we get that. We've already attended workshop. We're showing up at council meetings and generating products through discussions that we hope are useful to the council. And engaging them at every step of the way. So both council staff we've had discussions with, council members, and then folks on various advisory committees. So that's our strategy there, is just to be engaged throughout. As an example of this, the folks on Climate and Communities Initiative team were provided the survey ahead of time. They commented on the survey and we made adjustments accordingly to help it match better with their needs. Data availability. Laura, do you want to have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can touch briefly on that. So data availability for the empirical work, we're lucky that Reliance and The social vulnerability scores are already readily available via the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment. I was just trying to find the website real fast, but I couldn't. There's a cool kind of interactive map where you can click on different communities and for different metrics related to reliance and social vulnerability, it will tell you about each community. In terms of the species risk that will go into the community vulnerability, once that's completed, yes, I hope to make that data available. Probably a lot of the code and data, I'll have a GitHub page set up. But as of now, that is not, we don't have that data yet.
Great, thank you. Another question here. Are you able to break down the level of dependency on commercial fishing dependence for the income source? For example, is the fisher 100% dependent on commercial fishing revenue?
Laura, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I am a little confused if you mean for the empirical or for the surveys. So I'll touch on both. So within the surveys, first of all, we are asking if the fishers have any other means of income. So that will help give us the sense of if they're 100% dependent or not. Within the empirical assessment, slightly different than what your question's getting at, but we will break down how dependent they are on each of the different fisheries resources. So Dungeness crab or salmon or rockfish. But in terms of if they're 100% dependent on commercial fishing, I would need to look into more. It doesn't break it down for individual fishers. It's all just based on the community, how reliant they are on commercial fishing. So back look at how reliance breaks down, but I think it's that doesn't explicitly factor in if they're dependent on other resources, but definitely if there is an economy within that community that they are otherwise dependent on, then they will have lower fishing reliance than, say, another community.
I think I just add to that. We do ask, if they're financially independent, if they're able to support a family, and also whether they feel that there are opportunities that are available, whether they could easily move into a new fishery or, what their feelings are about their own adaptive opportunities, how easy it would be to get income from other fishing and non-fishing activities. What their level of confidence is in being able to adapt and stay strong and viable.
And maybe it's worth also mentioning that just within those people who, in terms of actually estimating the vulnerability of the communities, just in case that was also part of the question, Laura is weighting the vulnerability for each community by the landings. So it doesn't assume equal distribution of landings and therefore a risk to those species across the geography that we're looking at.
Great, thanks. And I also want to acknowledge, I know some folks are submitting questions in the chat. And don't worry, I am capturing those as well as those in the Q&A. We might not get to them all, but know that I am seeing them and we're doing the best we can to balance. So just wanted to acknowledge that. We have another question here. Have you considered surveying those who depend on income from recreational fisheries? For example, Washington's large recreational razor clam fishery.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's a really important point as well. We considered it when we were initially developing the study, and then because of resources, really, we have decided to put that off to another project that focuses specifically on rec fishing, generally. And I'd also add aquaculture as another sector that we're interested in generally, thinking about just vulnerability of all essentially ecosystem services around food that comes from the ocean as well as rec fishing.
Cool. Okay. Another question here. Will you be reaching out to license holders that operate in state fisheries, Dungeness crab or other just federally, such as Dungeness crab or just other federally managed fisheries?
Yes. Yeah. So if a person is a commercial license holder in state or federal, they're in the pool to get the survey.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, just going back and forth between two, so I'm catching the questions. Okay, another one, a clarifying question. Does the social vulnerability that you presented include risk associated with climate change, or is it only the adaptive capacity, and will you incorporate the climate change risk later?
No, it includes both. So the idea is that, think about, your community. That community is dependent on, let's say, maybe there's 10 really important species or something like that. So each one of those species has a risk associated with it that depends on that species exposure to some sort of climate stressor and then its sensitivity to that. And then so then what we get from that is this idea that, okay, I fish species, I fish, let's say I'm focused on groundfish, and this constellation of groundfish has a certain risk associated with fishing. So that's the risk part of the equation. And then the community side of that is the adaptive capacity. So then we combine those together for every community on the West Coast that's dependent on those resources, and we use that to estimate the vulnerability. Laura, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I'm not sure if Maya's question was then more about what climate change risk might be in the adaptive capacity component specifically. So like climate, like risk to other climate change factors. So I will say that one thing that I do have data on that I haven't factored in yet, but could, is there is for all the communities data on sea level rise. So we could think that, more risk to sea level rise would definitely lead to lower adaptive capacity. So that is one additional climate factor that we could add in to the adaptive capacity component.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, like we haven't, for example, looked at the risk to shoreside infrastructure from sea level rise as an example. That stuff like that. That's a good.
And then I'd like to jump into, this is Allison. I noticed that Maya also had kind of a companion question, which is, do you think it is likely that the perception of risk from the fishing community is different from the quote true risk calculated from empirical data? If so, what are the management implications of this? I really like this question, and I think it's so important. So very, very often we find that perception differs from empirical data. And some of that is, I would never use the term true risk. Some of that is associated with the fact that the empirical data, you've got to decide what to measure, where to measure it, how, over what averaging periods. So perception can be completely true and can be very locally experienced, and a empirical data set may smooth out or average out some of those local particular vulnerabilities or particular challenges or particular hardships that are being experienced in certain places. And so they can both be true at the same time, which is why I really like this question, and it's such a great one. And the management implications of this at the baseline, at the very bottom of it all, would be an awareness that folks are experiencing locally and in a very finely granular way, very different situations, very different vulnerabilities in some cases. Or perhaps there are other times when they're experiencing exactly what the empirical data are showing, but they are perceiving and feeling it more keenly because it's more dreaded, or it feels less fair, or the other sort of qualitative characteristics that I raised before. And those do drive how people make decisions. So for an individual who is perceiving that and is feeling those more qualitative aspects of a risk, and therefore rating it more highly, that's super important. And the management implications include everything from an awareness about that, an ability to communicate across those boundaries, and also being able to address what some of that is about. There can be very locally experienced vulnerabilities that need to also be strategized about and planned for and addressed and communicated about. So I really like that question. So I wanted to jump in and just call that one out.
Yeah, and I think that's the essence of the project, is that both can be true, um, and that's important.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for just maybe a couple more, but here's one that that was sent to me in chat. There are many types of fishers, tribal, for example. Can you comment on how your study will be influenced by missing this critical demographic? Do you plan on surveying tribal fishers, or is this something that the tribes should organize themselves?
We are surveying tribal fishers, tribal commercial fishers. So that's as part of the survey, and then likewise with the empirical stuff, because we're doing this at the community scale, some of that information will be also incorporated into the empirical analysis that Laura talked about. So it is something that's important to us and that we're trying to adequately cover.
Great, thanks. And I think our final question is a question about uncertainty. How do you aim to deal with uncertainties in our ability to project ecological changes well? And really the same question for social vulnerability too. This respondent is just curious what strategies we can take as a research community to deal with that.
Yeah, before Laura and Alison both jump on this, I want to also highlight that this topic is really important. I think will be a big focus of the Ocean Modeling Forum work, is to think about how to appropriately and adequately get uncertainty included in these sorts of things. And now I'll let you all answer.
Oh, I completely agree with Phil. And I would say that one of the things that we always try to get at is what are the various components of that uncertainty? There's usually different sources of uncertainty, and some of them we may be able to do something about, and others we may just have to describe and estimate their magnitude and state them along with our results. I wouldn't go much further than that right now until we get further along in the research.
This is Laura. I will say for the empirical work, I will be running a ton of sensitivity analyses, especially with the species risk component, thinking about finding the risk to different climate factors, temperature, pH, oxygen, how to combine those in different ways. Do you use all of them? Just looking at different ways of framing the data or spinning the data and how that changes our answers. With the social vulnerability component, we can do similar sensitivity analyses, thinking about how we combine the different indices to come up with an overall score. So definitely going to be running some analyses to try to address some of that uncertainty.
Well, great. Thank you so much. We are at the hour, and so we will conclude this webinar. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, and feel free to reach out after, either to us at LenFest or the research community. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the webinar now.